I sat at the head of the long oak table in the lawyer's office, looking at the people who used to call me Dad with something resembling affection. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead. My daughter-in-law, Patricia, leaned across the table and slid a folder toward me like she was dealing a winning hand of cards. She smiled, not a grieving smile, not a kind smile, but the smile of someone who had been waiting a long time for this exact moment. "Now that Eleanor's gone," she said, her voice smooth as oil, "it's time you stepped aside and let Marcus run things the way they should be run. You're 73, Walter. Nobody expects you to keep pretending you're still useful." My son Marcus sat beside her, staring at his hands. He didn't argue with her. He never did anymore. I looked at the two of them, at the confident tilt of Patricia's chin, and I did something that confused them both. I smiled back. 3 seconds later, the door opened, and my attorney walked in carrying a single sealed envelope that was about to end their entire world. But before I tell you what was inside that envelope, let me know where you're watching from tonight, my friend, and if you've ever had to sit across from family members who showed you their true colors right when you needed them most, hit that like button, because this one's for you. To understand how I ended up in that office, you have to go back 6 days, to the morning after I buried my wife of 41 years. The house was unbearably quiet without Eleanor in it. I stood at the kitchen counter that Tuesday morning, holding a coffee mug I didn't have the energy to fill, staring at the chair across the table where she used to sit doing the crossword every single day for 4 decades. Pancreatic cancer had taken her in 11 weeks. 11 weeks from diagnosis to the funeral home, and I still hadn't figured out how a man was supposed to keep breathing through that kind of loss. I heard the front door open without a knock. Marcus still had a key, and Patricia walked into my kitchen wearing a tailored gray suit, like she had a board meeting to get to rather than a father-in-law to console. She set a thick folder on my counter with a soft thud. "What's this?" I asked her, keeping my voice level. "It's a transition agreement," she said, not bothering to sit down. "For Caldwell Tool and Machine. You built a wonderful company, Walter, truly. But you're grieving, you're exhausted, and frankly, the board has concerns about your judgment right now. We think it's best if Marcus takes over as CEO immediately, with full operational control. You'll stay on as Chairman Emeritus. It's a title. It means something nice on a business card." Marcus stood behind her in the doorway, unable to meet my eyes. He was 44 years old and he still couldn't speak in front of his wife without her permission. Caldwell Tool and Machine wasn't just a company to me. Eleanor and I started it in 1986, in a rented garage in Dayton, Ohio, with $11,000 and a single CNC machine I'd bought used from a man who was going bankrupt. We worked 16-hour days. Eleanor did the books at our kitchen table at night, while I learned how to run a machine shop by trial, error, and stubbornness. We built that company into something that employed 210 people and supplied precision parts to half the auto manufacturers in the Midwest. And 3 days after I put my wife in the ground, my daughter-in-law was standing in my kitchen with a pen, asking me to hand it to a man who, God love him, had never once in his life asked me how the business actually ran. "I need time to think about this," I told her, sliding the folder back an inch. "There isn't a lot of time, Walter," Patricia said, her tone sharpening just slightly. "The board meets Friday. We'd like this settled before then." After they left, I stood at my window and watched Patricia pause by her car in the driveway. She thought I couldn't see her in the reflection of the glass. She pulled out her phone, typed something quickly, hit send, and muttered 4 words to herself with a small, satisfied smile before she got in the car and drove off. "He's softening up." I stood there a long time after the taillights disappeared down the street. A man can lose his wife and still have his mind. I learned that lesson standing in my own kitchen that night, and I decided then and there that whatever Patricia thought she was preparing for, she had badly underestimated the man she was preparing it for. The next morning, I drove to the plant before sunrise, the way I had nearly every morning for 38 years. I needed to walk those floors and remember who I was before grief and greedy relatives tried to convince me otherwise. I badged into the executive entrance, except the reader blinked red. Access denied. I tried it twice more. Same result. "Having some trouble there, Walter?" I turned and found Greg Holloway standing near the break room, dressed far too sharply for 6 in the morning, smelling like he'd bathed in cologne. Greg was our CFO, a man Eleanor had never fully trusted, though she'd never told me exactly why. "My badge isn't working," I said. "Ah, right, I should have mentioned it. Greg said, smiling in a way that didn't reach his eyes. Marcus authorized a full security overhaul this weekend. New protocols while you take some time to grieve. Nothing to worry about. Go home and rest, Walter. We've got it handled. I nodded, thanked him for his concern, and walked calmly back to my truck. My hands steady even though my blood was not. They were locking me out of the company I built with my own 2 hands, 3 days after my wife's funeral, and they were doing it with smiles on their faces. I drove home and went straight to my study, to the gun safe in the closet floor that didn't hold a gun. 10 years earlier, after a nasty incident with a competitor trying to steal our designs, I'd had an old army buddy, a man who now did cybersecurity consulting, build a private mirror drive that backed up every financial record in the company, completely separate from the company's own servers. Nobody knew it existed. Not the board, not Marcus, not even Eleanor. I pulled it out, connected it to my laptop, and was about to start digging when my phone rang. A number I didn't recognize. A hospital. Mr. Caldwell? This is Riverside Memorial. We're calling about your granddaughter, Lily. She's been in a car accident. My hands went cold. I grabbed my keys and drove faster than I should have, running 2 yellow lights that turned red before I cleared the intersection, praying the entire way that I wasn't about to bury someone else I loved that same month. Lily was 16. She'd been driving home from soccer practice in the car Marcus and Patricia had bought her for her birthday, and a delivery truck had run a stop sign. I burst through the emergency room doors and found Marcus pacing, his tie loosened, his face gray. Patricia sat in a plastic chair, typing furiously on her phone, looking more inconvenienced than terrified. What happened? I asked, grabbing Marcus by the shoulders. How bad is she? She hit the guardrail, Marcus said, his voice shaking. She's got a broken arm, some internal bruising, but they're saying she lost a lot of blood before the paramedics got her stabilized. A doctor came through the double doors a few minutes later, a tired-looking woman in scrubs with dark circles under her eyes. Lily is stable for now, she said, but her hemoglobin is dropping and we need to get blood into her fast. She's O negative, which is the universal donor type, but it also means we're critically low in our own bank right now because of a multi-vehicle pileup on the interstate this morning. We need a direct family match urgently. Mom, Dad, we'd like to bring you both back for cross-matching right now. Something cold settled into my stomach, separate from the fear for Lily. I am AB positive. Eleanor was A positive. Marcus, our biological son, had always been a positive. I remembered it clearly from when he broke his collarbone at 14 and needed a transfusion. Patricia, I recalled from an old conversation at a family barbecue years back, was also A positive. 2 A positive parents simply cannot produce an O negative child. It is not rare. It is not unlikely. It is genetically impossible. I stood frozen in that hallway while the math rearranged my entire understanding of my family. I looked at Patricia, who was loudly and aggressively demanding the doctor call a private clinic to fly in blood by helicopter, clearly trying to avoid the donation request entirely. Then I looked at my son. Marcus was not confused. A confused father asks questions. A confused father says, "That doesn't sound right. Can you double-check the chart?" Marcus was staring at the floor, sweating, his jaw clenched so tight I could see the muscle twitching beneath his skin. He knew. Whatever this meant, my son already knew it. I did not say a word in that hallway. Confronting a cornered animal in public is a mistake I learned to avoid decades earlier, in boardrooms far less forgiving than a hospital corridor. I simply suggested, in a calm voice, that Marcus and I get coffee from the cafeteria while we waited on the helicopter transport Patricia had demanded and was now paying an absolute fortune for. We sat across from each other in the hospital basement, 2 cups of bad coffee between us. The doctor mentioned Lily's blood type. I said quietly, "O negative. That's curious, isn't it, son? Your mother and I are both A positive. You're A positive. Patricia's A positive too, if I remember right. How exactly does a girl with those parents end up O negative?" Marcus's hand trembled so badly he nearly knocked his coffee over. "It's a lab error, Dad," he snapped, too fast, too loud, his voice cracking with panic rather than confusion. "These things happen in emergency rooms all the time. Don't do this right now. My daughter is in surgery." I had spent 4 decades reading men across negotiating tables. I knew exactly what panic looked like when it was hiding something, and I knew exactly what confusion looked like when it was genuine. My son was not confused. My son was terrified of being caught. I let it go for now. I told him he was probably right, that it was probably nothing, and I watched him exhale like a man who thought he'd dodged a bullet. He had no idea the bullet was still loaded. Lily stabilized that evening. The transfusion worked, and by nightfall, the doctors said she'd make a full recovery. I hugged Marcus, gave Patricia a stiff nod, and told them I'd check in tomorrow. Then I drove to the pharmacy, bought 2 pairs of nitrile gloves and a box of small, sterile evidence bags, and drove to their house that night under the cover of bringing them dinner. While Marcus reheated the casserole I'd brought, I excused myself to wash up and check on Lily. Her room was empty. She was still at the hospital overnight for observation, but her bathroom yielded exactly what I needed, a hairbrush with several strands still caught in the bristles, root and all. I bagged it carefully and slipped it into my coat pocket. On my way back down, I passed through the mudroom, where Marcus's gym bag sat by the door, the same place it always sat after his Tuesday workout. I found a ball cap on the hook above it, with several hairs caught along the inner band. I bagged those too. I left 20 minutes later, thanking Patricia for such a hard day, and drove 2 counties over to a 24-hour genetics lab I'd found online, the kind that does paternity and ancestry work with no questions asked. I paid $4,000 in cash for an expedited 72-hour result, and drove home as the sky started turning gray with early dawn. As I pulled into my driveway, my phone buzzed an alert from the private monitoring system my Army buddy had built into the company's servers a decade earlier. Someone was attempting to authorize a wire transfer of $3.8 million using credentials that mimicked my own digital signature. I did not go to the plant. I went straight to my study, locked the door, and logged into the mirror system. I watched in real time as Greg Holloway, sitting in his office at 6 a.m, tried to push that transfer through 4 shell accounts registered in Nevada with names so generic they'd never raise a flag in a routine audit. Heartland Equipment Solutions, Midwest Fabrication Partners, Buckeye Industrial Consulting, and Crestline Logistics Group. I traced every invoice, every dummy purchase order, every fraudulent consulting fee stretching back nearly 9 months. 9 months. The exact week Eleanor's diagnosis came back terminal. While I sat in hospice rooms holding my dying wife's hand, Greg Holloway and someone else had been bleeding our company dry, and the money wasn't coming from operating capital. It was coming directly from the employee pension fund, the retirement savings of 210 machinists, welders, and line workers who had given their lives to that company alongside me. I dug through the transition agreement Patricia had dropped on my counter days earlier, the one I'd nearly signed out of grief and exhaustion. Buried on page 11, beneath dense legal language about operational authority, was an indemnification clause language that would have made me the sole certifying signature on every financial record from the prior year, right as the annual audit was scheduled to begin. They didn't want the company. They wanted a fall guy with my name on it. I sat in my study for 2 days straight, drinking black coffee, saying very little to anyone, letting Marcus's anxious phone calls go to voicemail. On the 3rd morning, the lab called. The results were ready for pickup. I drove to the clinic alone. I didn't open the envelope in the lobby. I sat in my truck in the parking lot, the engine running, my hands not quite steady, and tore it open. Probability of paternity, 0%. The subject known as Lily Caldwell is excluded as the biological offspring of the subject known as Marcus Caldwell. I sat there for a long moment with the truck idling, grief washing over me in a wave I hadn't expected. Grief for a granddaughter I'd loved completely for 16 years. Grief for the family I thought I had. Gratitude, quietly, that Eleanor had passed before having to learn this. And then the grief burned away into something colder and far more useful. If Marcus wasn't Lily's father, someone else was. And whoever it was, Patricia would have chosen someone useful, someone close to the money. I drove straight to the office of a private investigator. A retired police captain friend of mine had recommended years ago. A sharp, quiet man named Russell Boone who'd spent 2 decades in financial crimes before going independent. I slid a blank check across his desk. I need everything, I told him. Patricia's whole life, before Marcus, during Marcus, and start with Greg Holloway. 3 days later, Russell met me at a diner off the interstate and slid a thick folder across a sticky table. The first page was a photograph, time-stamped 3 weeks earlier, of Patricia and Greg Holloway sitting close together at a restaurant 2 towns over, his hand resting over hers. They didn't meet at the company 5 years ago like they always claimed, Russell said. They went to the same business school 22 years ago. Lived together for a year before she ever met your son. DNA confirms it. Greg Holloway is Lily's biological father. She's never stopped being involved with him, Walter. Not for one single year. The deepest blow was still waiting in that folder. Russell slid out one final document. A printed email. 11 years old. Sent from Marcus's private account to Patricia's. I have to be honest with you. The doctor confirmed it today. I'm sterile. Permanently. From the mumps when I was a kid. There's no chance I can ever father a child. If my mother finds out, she'll invoke the bloodline clause in the family trust and cut me out completely. We have to keep this quiet. Lily has to stay our secret. She's the only thing keeping my inheritance safe. My son had known for 11 years. He had known Lily wasn't his, and instead of telling me the truth, he had chosen to protect a fortune he hadn't earned by lying to his dying mother and his grieving father. I sat in that booth a long time, the diner noise fading around me, before I finally folded the dossier shut and looked up at Russell. Thank you, I said. I know exactly what to do now. That night I called Marcus, let my voice tremble with manufactured exhaustion, and told him I'd reconsidered the transition agreement. I asked him and Patricia to come by Friday morning, before the board meeting, so I could sign everything in front of the family. He sounded so relieved he nearly cried on the phone. I spent the next 2 days playing the broken old widower's slow steps, unkempt hair, the photograph of Eleanor placed prominently on my desk. Meanwhile, my attorney, a sharp, relentless woman named Diane Foster who had represented our company since the early 90s, worked behind the scenes. We handed everything, the embezzlement trail, the shell companies, the spoofed wire transfer to a federal contact at the FBI's white-collar crimes division she'd worked with for years. We provided the paternity results to support the bloodline clause Eleanor had insisted on writing into our family trust decades earlier, the clause stating that ownership of Caldwell tool and machine could only pass to direct biological descendants. Friday morning, I put on the navy suit I hadn't worn since Eleanor's last hospital gala fundraiser and drove to the company for the board meeting. The boardroom was packed. Patricia had clearly arranged an audience for her coronation. She sat at the head of the table in my old chair, Marcus beside her, Greg Holloway to her left, and Lily, still in a cast, scrolling on her phone, oblivious to everything closing in around her. A folder slid down the table toward me, an expensive pen resting on top. "This is the final agreement," Patricia announced, her voice carrying easily across the room. "All that's needed is your signature." I looked at her for a long moment. I picked up the pen, felt its weight, and set it back down without writing a single letter. "No," I said. The doors swung open. Diane Foster walked in flanked by 2 federal agents in dark windbreakers, and the temperature of that room dropped 20 degrees in an instant. "I'm legally representing Walter Caldwell in all matters concerning the Caldwell Family Trust," Diane announced, her voice booming with the kind of authority that silences a room. She tossed the sealed genetics report onto the center of the table. "This report, independently verified 72 hours ago, confirms Lily Caldwell is not the biological descendant of Marcus Caldwell. Per the explicit terms of the trust established by the late Eleanor Caldwell, any transfer of corporate assets requires verified biological lineage. This transition agreement is void, effective immediately. S.T. Lily dropped her phone, her face draining of color, looking at her mother with wide, desperate eyes for some kind of denial. Patricia gave none. Her composure shattered into raw, naked panic. Greg Holloway shot up from his chair, and one of the federal agents was on him in an instant, a heavy hand on his shoulder forcing him back down. "Greg Holloway, Patricia Caldwell," the lead agent said. "You're under arrest for wire fraud and embezzlement from the Caldwell Employee Pension Fund." The room dissolved into chaos. Patricia screamed that she'd given Marcus 20 years of her life, that she deserved half of everything. Greg shouted that she was the one who'd pushed to drain the pension fund faster than he'd advised, that this was her doing as much as his. They turned on each other in seconds, the partnership of 2 decades collapsing into a screaming match in front of a stunned executive board. Marcus stood, shaking, pointing a finger at his wife. "How could you do this to me?" he yelled, putting on a final performance of innocent betrayal. I reached into my briefcase and threw the printed email onto the table in front of him. He went silent, staring at his own words from 11 years earlier, the fight draining out of him completely. He collapsed back into his chair and wept. Not performed tears this time, but the real kind. The kind that comes when a man finally understands he can't talk his way out of the truth anymore. I didn't comfort him. I dropped a single sheet of paper into his lap, an eviction notice and a termination letter. "You have 24 hours to clear out of the house I bought you," I said. "You're permanently removed from this company and from my estate. You made your choice 11 years ago, when you decided your mother's trust mattered less than your comfort." I turned to Lily last, 16 years old, frozen and terrified, a child caught entirely in a deception she never asked to be part of. I crouched down beside her chair so we were eye level. "None of this is your fault," I told her gently. "You didn't choose any of it. You're not responsible for what your mother and Greg did. I want you to know that I will always be your grandfather in every way that's ever mattered, no matter what a piece of paper says about blood. I'm setting up a trust for your education and your care, separate from all of this. And it's yours no matter what happens next. We're going to figure out the rest of this together, you and me, for as long as you'll let me." Lily broke down crying, and this time, I held her. The federal agents led Patricia and Greg out in handcuffs. Marcus left the building a broken man, and within 6 months he was working a retail job 2 towns over, finally learning the value of an honest day's labor, a lesson his mother and I had tried to teach him his whole life. I felt no satisfaction in that, only a quiet, tired sadness for the son I thought I'd raised. 6 months later, I stood with Diane Foster on the rooftop of the Caldwell building, signing new trust documents in the cold morning air. Half of my estate went into the Eleanor Caldwell Scholarship Fund, supporting working-class kids in Dayton who had ambition but no money behind it. The other half went into an employee ownership program for the 210 people who had built that company with their own hands and never once tried to steal a dime from it. Lily moved in with me that fall. I drive her to soccer practice now. I help with her algebra homework at the same kitchen table where Eleanor used to do the crossword every morning. She calls me Grandpa Walter, and some nights, when the house gets quiet the way it used to before all of this, I sit in my study and I think about what family really means. It was never about blood. It never was. It's about who stays. It's about who shows up, who tells the truth, who chooses you even when nothing requires them to. Eleanor used to say that a man's legacy isn't measured in what he leaves behind, but in who he chooses to leave it to. I think about that every single day now, watching Lily grow into a young woman who reminds me, more than anyone ever has, exactly why all that work was worth it in the first place. I lost a son. I gained a daughter who was mine the whole time, in every way that ever mattered. And if you've made it this far with me tonight, my friend, I hope you remember this: it's never too late to find out who really belongs at your table. Family was never the blood in Lily's veins, it was the hand that stayed to help with homework, the chair pulled out at the table, the truth chosen over comfort. Real love shows up even when nothing requires it to. So look around your own table tonight, my friend, and notice who's still sitting there. That's your family. Hold on to them. A small note for you. This story was crafted and fictionalized by AI purely for entertainment, though we hope its heart carried a genuine, positive lesson along the way.